You think you're better than me? You're nothing. I know what I am. I'll show you.
Hong Kong, November 1982. The city was in the middle of the loudest decade of its life. The harbor lights were still on at midnight. The neon signs above Nathan Road, the ones advertising import shops and karate schools and late-night noodle houses, were blinking the same way they always did, like the city itself was trying to stay awake, trying not to miss a single thing. And on this particular November night, there was a great deal to miss. The Hong Kong Coliseum stood at the edge of Hung Hom, a building shaped like an inverted pyramid, steel and glass rising above the waterfront like something that had been dropped from the sky and decided to stay. Inside, 1,500 seats had been filled since 6 o'clock. Not by fight fans, not by tourists, by people who lived and breathed martial arts cinema, choreographers, stunt coordinators, directors, producers, and fighters who had crossed over into the film industry and brought their muscle memory with them. This was the Asia-Pacific Martial Arts Film Summit. 3 days of panels, demonstrations, screenings, and closed-door conversations about the future of action cinema. The kind of event that happened once in a generation and was never properly documented because the people who attended it were too busy watching to take notes. The main hall seated 800. The overflow rooms held another 700. Every seat was taken. The lighting inside was the kind that film people prefer. Not too bright, not theatrical, functional and warm. The kind of light that makes every face in the room look like it belongs in a close-up. The stage at the front was broad, maybe 40 feet wide, with a single podium to the left, and 4 chairs arranged in a loose semicircle to the right, where panelists would sit during the discussions. Behind the stage, a projection screen displayed a simple white logo. On the floor in front of it, 3 rows of folding tables had been arranged for the press. And in the 3rd row of the main audience, not in the front, not trying to be seen, not wearing anything that announced who he was, sat Chuck Norris. He was wearing a dark gray blazer over a plain white shirt, no tie, dark slacks. The kind of outfit a man wears when he wants to be comfortable enough to sit through a 3-hour panel but still look like he came from somewhere. His boots were brown. His hair was the same way it always was, trimmed close at the sides, slightly longer on top, the kind of haircut that has no era because it was never chasing one. He was 42 years old, 6-time world professional middleweight karate champion, undefeated in tournament competition for 6 consecutive years before he retired from fighting entirely to pursue film. He had competed across America, Europe, and Asia, and he had not lost, not once, not to anyone who tried to make a name by going through him. He had stepped away from competition on his own terms at the height of his ability, the way champions do when they still have something left and choose not to spend it proving points. By 1982, he had been in Hollywood for nearly a decade. His films had made money, serious money, a force of one, the octagon, an eye for an eye. Each one built his reputation a little higher, not just as an actor, but as the real thing, a man who did not need camera tricks or careful editing to look dangerous, because he had been dangerous long before any camera was pointed at him. In America, his name meant something specific. In Hong Kong, it meant something else. Here, in the city where martial arts cinema had been invented and reinvented and exported to the rest of the world, Chuck Norris was respected in the way that foreign legends are respected, with admiration from a safe distance, with curiosity, with the unspoken awareness that he had crossed over into their territory and managed not to embarrass himself. He had trained under Bruce Lee. He had been Bruce Lee's most famous screen opponent. He had appeared in Way of the Dragon and been defeated on camera by the most iconic martial artist who had ever lived. That fact followed him, not as shame. He had never seemed ashamed of it, but as a kind of permanent asterisk, a footnote in the biography of a man who was genuinely formidable, but had nonetheless been written into history as the man Bruce Lee beat. He was sitting quietly in the third row, a cup of tea on the armrest to his right, his program folded once along the top edge and resting on his knee. The man to his left was Pat Johnson, his longtime training partner and choreography collaborator, who had worked with him on half a dozen films and who was whispering something about the panel schedule. The man to his right was an empty seat. Chuck was not watching the stage. He was watching the room. There is a thing that happens with men who have spent their lives reading in other men's intentions through physical movement, through the shift of weight before a strike, through the angle of shoulders before an attack. They never fully stop reading a room. They sit in crowds and they see things other people don't see. They notice who is tense. They notice who is performing. They notice who is watching them. Chuck noticed, without looking for it, that he was being watched. From across the hall, near the left aisle, standing rather than sitting, holding a bottle of water and talking to two men Chuck didn't recognize, was Jackie Chan. He was 28 years old. Let that number sit for a moment. Because in November of 1982, 28 sounds young, until you understand what those 28 years had contained. Jackie Chan had been enrolled in the China Drama Academy at the age of 6. Not enrolled the way children are enrolled in after-school programs or weekend classes. Enrolled in the way children are conscripted. 10 years of training so physical, so relentless, so completely focused on breaking the body down and building it back up as an instrument, that the people who survived it, and not all of them did, came out the other side with something that was not quite human in its precision. He had been performing since childhood. Stunts, bit parts, background work. He had been a stunt double and a stunt coordinator before he was 20. He had broken bones, his nose, his fingers, his ankle, his skull in one accident that should have killed him and didn't. And he had come back from each one not more cautious but more committed, as though the injuries were simply information about what he could and could not survive. By 1982, Project A was 6 weeks from release. Project A would change action cinema permanently. Nobody in the hall knew that yet. But Jackie Chan knew it. He had spent 2 years making it. He had designed sequences that had never been attempted before, falls and impacts and physical comedy so precisely controlled and so genuinely dangerous that the crew had stopped the production twice to beg him to reconsider. He had not reconsidered. He was 5'9" and 170 pounds of something that moved through space the way water moves, finding the angles, using the environment, never going in a straight line when a curved one was more efficient. He had studied Hapkido. He had studied Taekwondo. He had studied wushu and northern Shaolin and the kind of practical street-level technique that doesn't have a name because it was never taught in a school. He had synthesized all of it into something that was entirely his own, fast, fluid, inventive, and built on a physical bravery that bordered on the irrational. He was not the biggest man in the room. He was not the most decorated man in the room. But the two men he was talking to were leaning forward, not back, the posture of people who are listening to someone who has something to say and knows how to say it. Jackie Chan was in the middle of a story, gesturing with his water bottle, his other hand tracing something in the air. An arc, a trajectory, the path of something falling, and the two men were laughing, but carefully, the way people laugh when they're not sure whether the story is funny or horrifying. He was wearing all black. Black jacket, black trousers, simples, white sneakers. No jewelry, no watch visible. His hair was short and slightly unruly in a way that did not look accidental. He had not looked at Chuck Norris yet. But Chuck had been in enough arenas to know the difference between someone who hasn't noticed you and someone who is choosing not to notice you. Jackie Chan was choosing. The first panel of the evening was titled East Meets West, the Future of Global Action Cinema. The moderator was a Hong Kong film journalist named David Chow, a small, precise man in his 50s who had been writing about martial arts cinema since before most of the people in the room had started training. He spoke in Cantonese and English in alternating sentences, switching so smoothly that people who only understood one language felt they were getting the complete version. The panelists were four: a Japanese director whose name no one in the Western press could pronounce correctly, a Hollywood stunt coordinator who had worked on 3 Chuck Norris films and 1 James Bond production, a veteran Hong Kong choreographer who had been in the industry since the Shaw Brothers era and who sat through every panel at every event in the same posture, arms crossed, expression unreadable, the posture of a man who has seen everything twice and is willing to be surprised once more, and Jackie Chan. He sat at the far right of the panelist chairs, the water bottle now on the floor beside him, his left ankle resting on his right knee, completely at ease in a way that only people who are deeply comfortable with being looked at can manage. The moderator opened with a question about the evolution of the action genre. The Japanese director answered first. He spoke for 3 minutes about the influence of samurai cinema on Western westerns and the cyclical nature of influence. How Hollywood borrowed from Japan, Japan borrowed back, and the audience on both sides never quite knew who had paid for what. The Hollywood stunt coordinator talked about technology, wire rigs, crash mats, the increasing sophistication of camera systems that could capture movement that previous generations of film equipment had simply been too slow to record. The Hong Kong choreographer said 4 words: faster, bolder, more real. Then he crossed his arms again and looked at the moderator as if to say, "I believe I have answered your question." The moderator smiled and turned to Jackie Chan. Jackie Chan leaned forward. He said, in English, clearly and without preamble, "The era of the static martial arts film is finished." He paused, not for effect. He was choosing his next words. The audience has changed. They have seen the techniques. They know what a spinning back kick looks like. They know what a takedown looks like. They are not impressed anymore by the move itself. They are impressed by what the move costs. They want to see the consequence, the pain, the recovery. They want to see a man who gets hurt and keeps going, not a man who gets hurt and wins. A man who gets hurt and gets up and gets hurt again and still finds a way. That is the story now. The invincible hero is finished. The room was quiet, not the quiet of boredom. The quiet of attention. The moderator asked a follow-up question, something about specific filmmakers who embodied this new approach. Jackie Chan named 3 Hong Kong directors. Then he paused again, and this is the moment that Pat Johnson, sitting in the third row, would describe 11 years later in an interview for a martial arts magazine as the moment the temperature in the room changed. Jackie Chan looked up from the panel table, looked directly into the audience, and said, "The American approach to martial arts film has been very successful, very profitable. I respect the business. But artistically, the era of the single technique, the one-dimensional champion, that era is over. The audience will not accept it for much longer." He was not looking at Chuck Norris when he said it. He was looking slightly to the left of where Chuck Norris was sitting, which, as anyone who has spent time around competitive fighters will tell you, is precisely where you look when you are talking about someone and you want them to know it without giving them the dignity of direct eye contact. Pat Johnson set down his program. The woman in the row ahead of Chuck Norris turned around. Not all the way, just a slight rotation of her shoulders, and then turned back. Chuck Norris did not move. He picked up his tea. He took one sip. He set it back on the armrest. His face was the face of a man doing arithmetic, not rushed, not emotional, just working through something quietly. The way you work through a problem that you've seen before in a different form and know has a limited number of solutions. The panel continued, but something had shifted. The 500 people in that building, the ones who understood the geography of what had just been said, who knew who was in the third row, who knew what Jackie Chan had built his reputation on and what Chuck Norris had built his on. Those people were no longer watching the stage. They were watching the third row. And nobody in that hall knew yet that what had just been set in motion would end before the night was over in a way that none of them would fully agree on for the next 40 years. The panel ended at 9:47. The applause was polite in the way that applause is polite when a room is thinking about something else. People stood. Conversations broke into small groups. The press table emptied first. Journalists moving toward the panelists with recorders and notebooks. The quiet professional scramble of people whose job is to get the quote before the moment dissolves. Jackie Chan stepped off the stage and was immediately surrounded. Chuck Norris did not move from his seat. Pat Johnson leaned over and said something low. Chuck shook his head once, not dismissively, just the way a man shakes his head when the answer is no, and he doesn't feel the need to explain why he was going to wait. It took 11 minutes. The crowd thinned. The press finished. The 2 men Jackie had been talking to earlier reappeared at his shoulder, and the 3 of them began moving toward the side exit, the one that led to the hospitality corridor, where the bar had been open since 7, and where most of the real conversations of the evening were happening. Chuck stood up. He folded his program once along the top edge, the way a man folds something he intends to keep, and placed it inside his jacket pocket. He adjusted the blazer with one hand. He did not hurry. He moved through the thinning crowd toward the same exit. The corridor was narrow and well lit, maybe 60 feet long, lined on both sides with framed film posters. Hong Kong productions from the 60s and 70s, faded at the edges, the kind of thing that ends up in a hallway because it belongs to history but doesn't quite fit anywhere more prominent. Jackie Chan was standing near the far end, his back half turned, still talking. He heard the shift in the room before he saw the reason for it. The two men he was talking to went quiet first, not dramatically, just the small silence of people who have noticed something over your shoulder and are deciding whether to mention it. Jackie turned. Chuck Norris was standing 10 feet away. He was not close enough to demand attention, not far enough to seem like he was keeping distance. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, his weight even, his expression the expression of a man who has walked into 1,000 rooms and is comfortable in all of them. He said quietly, "I enjoyed the panel." A pause. The part about the invincible hero. The corridor had maybe 30 people in it. Within 4 seconds, it felt like all 30 of them had stopped breathing at the same time. Jackie Chan looked at him, not with hostility, with something more careful than hostility, assessment. The look of a man who has spent his life reading physical situations, measuring distance and intention and the weight behind a sentence, deciding in real time what something means. He said, "It was not personal." Chuck nodded slowly. "I know," he said, "but I want to ask you something, not in front of the panel. Right here." He took one step forward. "You said the invincible hero is finished. You said the single technique champion has no future." He stopped. "Come, show me." The 30 people in that corridor understood immediately what had just been asked. Not a fight, not a brawl. These were not young men with something to prove in the wrong direction. This was an invitation. Direct, clean, stripped of everything except the question itself. Jackie Chan was silent for 3 full seconds. Then he smiled, not the performance smile. The real one, slightly crooked, slightly surprised. The smile of a man who has just been handed something he wasn't expecting and finds it genuinely interesting. He set his water bottle on the windowsill behind him. He said, "Okay, what happened in the next 4 minutes in that corridor has been described differently by every person who witnessed it. Some say it was a full exchange. Techniques tested at half speed, the way serious practitioners spar when the point is not to injure but to understand. Some say it was briefer, a single sequence. Jackie moving, Chuck responding, one moment of contact, and then both men stepping back. What every account agrees on is this: Chuck Norris did not move the way Jackie Chan expected him to move. That was the thing Jackie said afterward. Not publicly, not in any interview, but in the corridor itself, in front of the 30 people who were standing close enough to hear. He said, in a voice that had lost its performance edge entirely, "You are faster than I thought." Chuck looked at him for a moment, then he said, "Every era has fast." He picked up his program from where he'd set it on the windowsill. He nodded once. Not at Jackie Chan specifically, but at the corridor, at the moment, at the thing that had just happened and resolved itself without anyone getting hurt. And then he walked back toward the main hall. He did not look back. Jackie Chan stood in the corridor for a long moment after Chuck left. The 2 men beside him said nothing. The 30 people around him said nothing. Then Jackie Chan picked up his water bottle, looked at it the way you look at something when you need something to do with your hands, and said to no one in particular, "The era is not over." He paused. "Not yet." Chuck Norris flew back to Los Angeles 2 days later. He never gave an interview about that night. He never mentioned Jackie Chan's name in connection with the summit. He never needed to. Some stories end with a knockout, some end with a submission, and some, the ones that last the longest, the ones people are still telling 40 years later in corridors exactly like that one, end with a man walking away in brown boots and a gray blazer, his program folded neatly in his pocket, the question already answered. Your era is over. He had heard that before. He would hear it again. He was still walking.